Hey everybody! So it's been a while since I've actually spoken about statistics and social science, at least directly. I certainly usually try to mention at least some kind of social scientific theory or research or whatever when I talk about current events or politics, but it's been a while since we've actually just spoken about social science. As such, I think it's about time we got right back to it, particularly given that of late, I've seen some seeming misunderstandings regarding concepts such as, in particular, reliability and validity across the skeptosphere, as well as what type of research is utilized in the social sciences, both quantitative and qualitative. What is it that social scientists do? The answer is we don't all just sit around in a room and fellate each other while we come up with ideas about, hey, here's how I think patriarchy works. I mean, certainly, probably some of them certainly do that. But when we talk about what is social science as it refers to numbers and measurements, no, that's not quite accurate. Thus, in today's How Do I Social Science video, we're going to cover a rather wide range of topics, but we're going to focus in particular on some of the basics as well as a detailed explanation of the types of reliability and validity, and the differences as well as the uses and challenges that face both quantitative and qualitative methodologies, how to come up with a hypothesis question or research questions, and generally just how to start your jaunt into the social sciences and how to read social science research, because that is the point of these videos. But also, we'll be getting into some of the basics of the uses and purpose of mixed methodology for this. Anyway, let's start out by going into the basics of determining what is a social science question, what is a science question in general, and subsequently, how do we research anything? How do we research any question that we might have? So put on your thinking caps, kids, get a question in mind, because we're going to start coming up with ideas of how to research, and figuring out how scientists go about how to research. Let's start with some basic terms when it comes to social science that we may have not covered yet. Let's say you want to study something. So as I said, get something in your mind that you want to study. You have a single thing, an idea. You have something, I think that's interesting, I want to understand it better. That thing that you want to study, that's called a concept. You may want to study something for any number of reasons that's not up for me to say. But the term concept generally refers to a singular thing that you have identified and want to further understand. A set of concepts, a whole bunch of concepts that you want to study, are what's called a conceptual scheme. However, a conceptual scheme does not imply any necessary relatedness between said concepts. Concepts that can be related to one another are called constructs. Of course, we are looking for constructs to be related, and as such, because when we look at the relatedness and the associations between constructs, we thereby can make predictions about the natural world. That is the purpose of science in general, and as such, social science as well, to make predictions by understanding the relationship between constructs. That is, how does this one construct relate to another? How does it affect another? How do these two variables relate and interact with one another? In research, we assess how variables or constructs are related to one another in a directed manner in order to account for extraneous variables. For example, in perhaps the most famous example, we know that violence and ice cream are correlated. As always, we need to be aware correlation is not causation, but keep with me for a second, this is a bit of a refresher. These two concepts, ice cream sales and violent crime, might seem to be, on their face value, to be related constructs. We find that as ice cream sales goes up, so does violent crime. But in actuality, they are merely within the same conceptual scheme, with pretty much nothing to do with each other, except for one variable that affects them both. What they share is an independent variable that affects them, and that is hot weather, heat. Basically, when it's hot, people commit more crime, and when it's hot, people eat more ice cream. That's an independent variable, or what's called an experimental variable. It's the predictive construct that, in an experiment, is manipulated in order to determine its effect on a dependent or outcome variable, or variables. Those are other constructs or even sets of constructs that are influenced in some way by the manipulation of the independent variable. So when we talk about manipulation, I could raise the heat and I would see that the dependent variables, for in this instance, ice cream sales and violent crime, would understandably probably raise as I raise the temperature. This is the relationship between the IV and the DV. I think I've covered variables a little bit in the past, but hey, it's always good to remember just some of the basics in the way that we use social science to make predictions by manipulating one construct, again the IV, and measuring how it consistently tends to affect another construct or set of constructs, the DVs. Now, be aware, we cannot make causal claims without the use of a true experiment when it comes to the IV and the DV, but we'll get into that sort of on a later episode. It's frankly just going to be too much to cover in this one. Just understand that this is about understanding the relationships between these ideas called constructs. We can't put the cart too much before the horse, though, and talk about true experimentation before we understand how the fresh fuck do we measure things. That is, how do we operationalize our variables? For example, if I'm begging for shekels on the street corner, and I want to, well, for my own benefit, understand the relationship between one construct, that is how many shekels I get, and another construct, human communication, I would seek out variables that would help to explain this relationship, that would explain a relationship between the two things, such as, for example, skin-to-skin contact, which we find is related to receiving more tips or gratitude. That is, that the longer you place your hand on someone's back or on their arm when you ask them for money, the more likely they are to give you money. But let's pretend we don't already know that and go back into the basic premise, in that we are asking this question for the very first time ever. We don't know the outcome, we're just asking the question. How do I get more tips and more money when asking for such on the street? Well, first you would need to be able to operationalize your variables, and there's a whole fucking shit load of them. There are all kinds of variables in this particular example, such as your personal hygiene. Do you stink?
Bro, will you please get out of here? You smell like cheese.
No.
You do smell like...
It's horseshit.
Well, whatever it is, it's terrible, okay? So
Well, let's call it what it is. It's horseshit, because I have it all in my hands.
Charlie,
So maybe
let's
that's
go.
what it's
Get
not
up.
cheese.
Well, the horse was eating a lot of cheese then. I don't know what it is. Just you stink.
Your physical appearance. What's called the halo effect would indicate that the more attractive you are, the more people are going to like you, and thereby the more they're probably going to give you money. There are entire other variables such as your own communication apprehension or communication skill, as well as the communication apprehension and communication skill of your communication partner in any individual exchange. Oh, there are so many variables. That's why we need to isolate a single variable, or two variables at least, to come to some kind of connection between our constructs. And in this instance, let's begin with just one. For the sake of example, we'll go with this, physical contact, the one I mentioned previously. So once again, I'm begging for shekels on the street, and I want to understand what's going to get me the most shekels, so I can wring my hands most thoroughly. And I want to understand how placing my hand on someone's shoulder or arm when I ask them for shekels might have an effect on how many shekels I receive. The way that we measure this is through operationalization. Operationalization of a variable requires that the variable can be observed and measured in some way. Now, there are multiple methods of measurement. Say that 3 times fast. I should know. It took me about 10 takes to say. Beyond the mere quantitative counting that we might typically think of when we think of the term measurement. That is that, well, I can count how many times I did a certain thing and how many times I saw a certain result. There are all kinds of ways of measuring a particular variable. It doesn't have to just be counting. Well, we might want to get into the counting, but there are other ways of getting into the counting beyond just what we would typically think of. For example, we can conduct interviews, and then I can pull out themes that I find consistent across the interviews in respondents' answers to a question that I asked, and operationalize that around a given construct based on the themes that I find. Any construct, however, that cannot be operationalized cannot be studied directly. That means that if I can't measure it, I can't study it. Not directly. However, that doesn't mean that we lack then any method of understanding or assessing the construct. For example, we cannot physically measure the weight of the Earth or any planet. It's simply impossible to place the planet Earth on a scale. We just can't do that. But we can use calculations based on what we know about physics and what we have been able to operationalize to measure and form a fairly highly accurate prediction, actually extremely highly accurate prediction in that case, of the weight of a planet, for instance. This, again, is the use of connecting constructs, and it allows us and leads us to understand something like that, how we can come to take one construct and operationalize it to assess an entirely different construct, like the weight of a planet. That right there, that again, is the use and purpose of connecting constructs and forming predictive models. And also leads us to the 3 important aspects of how we come to operationalize a construct. After all, how are we supposed to do this? How are we supposed to measure this thing? First, the operationalization must be practical and useful. It makes no sense, for example, to measure something in length in, say, hand size, given that hand size is not consistent across all people, and as such, any data collected from this particular form of operationalization and measurement would be completely random in its variability, and thus impractical and unuseful to any scientist or really anybody. If my hand size is completely different from yours, if I say, well, it looks like it's about 2 hand sizes long, that's going to be a completely different thing to you than it does for me. Second, the operationalization must have a justifiable argument behind its use. That is, when assessing how people feel about a topic, it frankly makes the most sense to, I don't know, ask them how they feel about it? Now, of course, there are all sorts of problems and caveats and issues when asking people about their own opinions. I don't even know where to start, be it from social desirability bias, in that some people just won't answer questions honestly out of fear of aberration from social norms, to respondents simply being disinterested and bored in the test and thus providing inconsistent answers. There are all sorts of problems when asking people how they feel. But that kind of test at least makes sense, and frankly, when it comes to assessing how people feel about things, asking them how they feel is, as of yet, pretty much the best we've got. We can hook up nodes to your brain and sort of see how your mind responds to certain stimuli, but really, I have to ask you how you feel to understand how you feel. And while we can account for much error, for, by example, reverse coding items in a test so that we can see if a respondent is, as I mentioned, bored and simply filling in answers of strongly agree, strongly agree, strongly agree across the board because they just don't care, it's still the best we've got, therefore that's the most logical way to operationalize this. More importantly though, the third thing we need to be aware of in operationalization is in ensuring that the measurement we are using, the test we are using, is in line with the conceptual definition of the constructs being measured. Remember in the beginning I told you to get that concept, and therefore that construct, in your head. You know what that is. We need to make sure that what we are measuring is what we think we are measuring. Otherwise, you're not measuring really fucking anything. For example, in much of the research used to justify the claim that video games are causally linked to violence, which, by the way, 5,000 studies later, you still can't find causally, but be my guest, continue to try. We cannot ethically measure violence. It's just unethical. It will never get through an institutional review board. It's not happening. Thereby, we need to use a proxy for violence. We need to use another sort of variable that is associated with violence. Again, something, as I said, we can't operationalize, although for a much different reason than why we can't measure a planet. In turn, then, what is typically measured is aggression, because we know aggression is in some ways associated with violence. But how is aggression operationalized in many of these studies? Well, it's typically highly suspect, at least in my opinion, and probably should be in yours if you take a look at some of this. For example, in many studies, aggression is measured by a subject's willingness to play a loud, obnoxious noise in the ear of another participant or a confederate. Ask yourselves, is that truly a measure of aggression? And is that a fair method of operationalization even under the criteria provided? Is that aggression? And even if it is aggression, is that in any way a measurement that might be associated with violence? This is why, hey, these are the kind of questions that I'm having you guys ask. And the reason why is because I'm sincerely trying to help you become more adept at reading research. We all should be able to look at research and assess it more critically. After all, we should be as academically literate as possible. It should help you to be able to understand it a little bit more. Anyway, now that we understand what a construct or variable is, and we have an idea of how to measure our variables through the process of operationalization, as such we need to move on to the point of all of this, which is to make predictions by isolating the associations between these measurable variables, these measurable constructs. We do this by forming a hypothesis. There are two types of hypotheses, directional and non-directional. Fairly simply, a directional hypothesis not only posits that two constructs will be related, but that they will be related in a particular direction. For example, I might surmise that intelligence, typically operationalized through measures of the G-factor, through the instrumentation of IQ, through the Weiss and Wechsler test, for example, is somehow associated with success in the Upper Class Twit of the Year award show.
Well, it certainly looks as though we're in for a splendid afternoon sport in this, the 127th Upper Class Twit of the Year show. Now, the competitors will be off any moment, so let me just identify them for you. Vivian Smith has O-level in kennel hygiene. Simon Zinc Trumpet Harris, married to a very attractive table lamp. Nigel Incubator Jones, his best friend is a tree, and in his spare time he's a stockbroker. Gervais Brook Hamster is in the Guards, and his father uses him as a waste paper basket. And finally, Oliver St. John Mollusk, Harrow in the Guards, thought by many to be this year's outstanding twit.
But I do not know in what direction. It seems possible that, in the case of the Upper Class Twit of the Year award show, that intelligence is potentially advantageous to a twit, but it's also possible that it serves as a disadvantage. I'm not sure. Twits seem to be a unique sort of class. Were I to test this, I would only ask the question, is IQ related to twit success? without knowing in which direction that may be. This type of hypothesis, despite not stating a direction of association between constructs, is different from a research question, which we will address in a later video. I don't think I'm going to get too much into research questions now, but generally speaking, a research question is not even proposing that there is any kind of association between different constructs, but just asking a completely open-ended question. Let's look at two things and figure out if there is a relationship. It's a little bit muggy there and muddy, but I would say that a non-directional hypothesis is discrete and different from a research question. In contrast, however, we have a directional hypothesis. I could hypothesize, for example, that communism is due to and ruins societies. This is not a mere question of possible association between ruination and communism, but a directed approach predicting that one thing, the independent variable being communism in this case, directly affects the others. That is, that society, as the dependent variable here, will be destroyed by the implementation of communism. Do you see how there is a directed approach? I'm not asking, how does communism affect societies? I am stating a directed approach and prediction. There are a number of criteria that define how we would form an appropriate hypothesis. First, the hypothesis must be clearly stated, in that you must attempt, when asking a question, to remove as much potential for misunderstanding as possible. This not only helps you, the asker, but makes answering of the question easier, as the question is more clear and concise. Second, the variables or constructs must be clearly defined and operationalized, as we have just been over, in that vague questions are, again, difficult to answer, particularly when elements of the question are impossible to isolate or operationalize. We need to know what our variables are and how to measure them before we can start asking definitive questions. Third, the differences between the variables must be evident and distinguishable. For example, while they might sound quite similar, we can assess the differences between variables of, let's say, state communication apprehension, which is something that occurs frequently when faced with public speaking events, and social anxiety disorder, which, while similarly involves a fear of communication, is distinct in that it is long-term, and does not overlap in a one-to-one manner with communication apprehension. These are distinct variables. We can definitively define them as disparate, and although they have similarities, they are not the same. Fourth is that your hypothesis should be based on some level of deductive reasoning, with the locus of the rationale at least partially located in extant research. That is, while we can certainly make many claims based on our own observations, our inductive reasoning, the things that we see around us, deduction is also kind of needed to form a solid hypothesis based on the available information that we have at hand. For all you know, for example, that very hypothesis that you think is super original and unique, that could have been assessed before. Thereby, you need to take a look at what's already been studied before you go charging in head first to make sure that not only has it not been studied before, but that there might be some conflicting information that you're not aware of within the extant available library of information. Finally, a hypothesis must be testable. Similarly with operationalization, we can sometimes use secondary methods of measuring a construct, but an untestable hypothesis? Frankly, we're talking now about a dead shark. An untestable hypothesis is a dead hypothesis.
I know.
Hypothesis.
I think is like a shark, it has to constantly move forward or it dies. And I think what we got on our hands is a dead shark.
It's not going anywhere. And with that, the fifth and final criteria is in many ways the most important. That if you cannot test your hypothesis, there is no way to move forward with it. If it's just not available right now, we could maybe test it in the future. But if you have posited such an extreme level of necessary criteria, for example, that would prevent your hypothesis from being tested, it can't be tested. Thereby, you can't make any associations or claims based on your hypothesis that can't be tested. Again, sometimes it sounds obvious, it sounds like no shit stuff, but you would be surprised how many people appear to be confused by this kind of information. If you have met all of those criteria, then you can begin to test your hypothesis and answer the question that you have posed. However, you need be aware that the association that you proposed is potentially non-extant. That's what's called the null hypothesis, the opposition to the predicted association that you anticipated. While testing seeks to reject the null, that is, to find the opposite of nothing, we need be prepared for the reality that our predictions are incorrect, in which case we fail to reject the null. When we seek out to test our hypothesis, we seek to find our hypothesis as true, as accurate, to confirm it. But it is as equally possible that despite everything that you have done to ensure that your hypothesis has a rationale, for you to still not find the hypothesis and thereby fail to reject the null. As such, not confirming the hypothesis. But hey, here's a really cool thing. Not finding what you anticipate is, in many ways, kind of more interesting than finding what you anticipated, particularly given when the hypotheses are made in the knowledge of all deductive rationale and extant data. That is, what's more revolutionary, I ask you? Having every single reason to expect a result and finding that result, confirming everything you believe of a no shit factor, or having every reason to expect a result and not finding it. Don't ask too many science journals about that, by the way, since unsupported hypotheses are sadly rarely published and generally relegated to the file drawer. Another thing to keep in mind as you read research. But the point is that failing to reject the null does not mean that something about your research is bad or poor. It actually can be a very interesting finding, to find that everything you expected was not what you actually found.
Dogs flew spaceships. The Aztecs invented the vacation. Men and women are the same sex. Our forefathers took drugs. Your brain is not the boss. Yes, that's right. Everything you know is wrong.
Although the main purpose of this video is to describe reliability and validity, which will comprise the rest of the episode, I first want to briefly explain experiments. Very briefly, as there will be an entire episode on experimentation. At least an entire episode. And I'm sorry I'm doing these slowly, but hey, we'll get to it. Just quickly, I want to explicate that there are many ways to test these hypotheses that you have formed in the step just labeled out. Some of them are causal, and, well, most of them, for the most part, are correlational. Just be aware that some hypotheses cannot, either for ethical or practical reasons, be tested in a true experimental environment that controls for extraneous variables in a manner that isolates the independent variable and the dependent variable. That is, that there are just some cases where we really cannot study things in a true experimental environment that accounts for variables outside of the ones that we're looking at. Again, we're going to get into this in more detail, but this need be explained, I think, a little bit here in the outset. You cannot always have a true experiment. There are just some reasons why this is not possible. However, this does not invalidate correlational research that cannot be done or was not done in a pure experimental environment, which again can be highly useful in making predictions. Even when it cannot indicate pure causation, we can still say we see a strong correlation between these variables time and time again. Therefore, perhaps we could predict something may happen based on X and Y, knowing that they are correlated. I just want to mention this briefly though, as woo lad, experimental design without question, apparently something that is widely misunderstood in the YouTube-ose sphere at this point. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's get into the nitty-gritty, the pork and beans, the meat and potatoes of this video, and that is this: reliability and validity. Those are important for anyone familiar with statistics, in any kind of way, or even concerned or interested in statistics. But given lately, at least in my opinion, once again, it seems that people with supposedly advanced degrees on this platform are seemingly significantly lacking in their comprehension of statistics. I feel, therefore, now more than ever that it is important that these things need to be discussed and explained in detail and in simplistic detail. That's not a knock. We need to go over these things simply so that we all understand them. Because frankly, if you get hung up on some of the basics, when you go into the more advanced bits, none of it's gonna make sense. It's all going to be jarbled garbage, right? Don't concern yourselves if you don't understand who or what I'm talking about in that. It's a vague reference. And by the way, if you don't know who or what I'm talking about, consider yourself to be blessed. Let's just get into this, and we'll have a very basic, and I would hope very educational and informational assessment and overview of reliability and validity, because it's super fucking interesting, at least in my opinion. So let's start with reliability. As a basic concept in the nomenclature, reliability is the measure of consistency that accounts for random error within a set of data. Oof, what the fuck does that mean? It basically means that an instrument or a measure is reliable when it forwards the same result over and over again, time and time again. Validity, in contrast, or instead, measures accuracy, and is intended to account for systemic or systematic errors within the research functions. That is, researchers, we are but mere humans, and we frequently, well, we fuck up. We fuck up in many different ways, which we will be covering here in detail in a few moments. Thus, measures of validity concern how we assess error on the part of the researcher. An important thing to note about reliability and validity is that any test can be reliable, but not valid. However, no test can be valid and not reliable. Think about it this way. If I'm trying to assess, for example, the quality of daily PewDiePie videos, and I go to YouTube every single day, well, I would see a PewDiePie video, and the extent of the video has nothing to do with its quality, right? I see that there's a video there every single day. The quality is highly variable, but the reliability is consistent. In contrast, where I try to assess the quality of a daily PewDiePie video, and he started uploading randomly once a month, we wouldn't even have a basis of analysis. We wouldn't have a reliable sample. The validity still is all up in the air, but we don't even have the reliability there to say daily PewDiePie video at any point in order to begin our assessment of the video quality and the validity of the quality of those videos. Sorry, I'm trying to be a little hip with the kids with that reference. I'm no good with it because I'm a dirty old weeaboo. But here's the quick and dirty meaning. I can only find constructs to be meaningfully associated if they are reliably associated time and time again. If these constructs are not reliably associated, there is no further meaning we can glean from the analysis. I don't know which one made more sense, the PewDiePie reference or the nitty-gritty, the direct approach, but hey, that's my attempt! Now let's talk about the types of reliability. That's right, fam, there's more than one, and if you start to get a bit weary here on the reliability side, woo, lad, wait till we get to validity. So first there is internal reliability, or internal consistency, which tests the specific measure of operationalization to see if the responses are stable over time. That is, at least in the social sciences, we generally have to come up with an instrument that is a battery of questions used to assess a social phenomena, typically. When I say battery, I mean a bunch of questions played in order. For example, often we're looking at how people feel or think about a thing they have experienced. Frankly, as I have stated, there are few other ways to assess the human mind than, well, to ask it. Ask it how it feels.
How do you feel? How do you feel? How do you feel?
I do not understand the question.
How are you feeling? We have to first know, as I mentioned, as is an important point in operationalization, that our instrument is measuring what we think it is measuring, and seeing consistency across an instrument is a method of assessing just that. For example, I made note that often participants get bored when answering Likert-type instruments and just fill in a hard strong agree across the board, or strong disagree across the board. The way to account for this is something called reverse coding, which means that we essentially take the same question and flip the orientation. For example, I love pussy versus I hate pussy. Hey, I'm talking about cats, okay? The point is, if you say strongly agree to loving the puss, but also strongly agree to hating the puss, well, outside of maybe just being confused or two-spirit or something, I'm going to know that you probably weren't reading the test correctly. You weren't giving your true answers, you were just filling in results, because you were bored. Or you were disinterested. In a true test of internal reliability, those two answers would have completely opposite results. You would have a strongly agree on I love the puss, and a strongly disagree on I hate the puss, for example. We test internal reliability with what's called Cronbach's alpha. When I speak of alpha levels in many of the videos that I do, this is not what I'm referring to, as this test is only used to see if an instrument, a method of operationalization again, is reliably consistent. If you happen to stumble across a Cronbach's alpha though, it is important to note that Cronbach's alpha ranges from 0 to 1, with 0.7 being the minimum of an acceptable item within a list of questions, to a 0.9 and above being considered an excellent item. Obviously no test is perfect, but just to reframe this, internal reliability is concerned with the tests we use to measure a construct and the individual questions on a battery or instrumentation. Next we have split half reliability, which takes a single test and splits the questions given within that said test into two sides for the purpose of analyzing the consistency across that one test into two halves. Again, this is all for the purpose of making sure we are measuring the same thing that we are trying to measure reliably, that is consistently over time. The most common type of reliability testing you are likely to find in any paper that you might come across as you are searching on the internet is a Cronbach's alpha. But if you do come across a test of split half reliability, it will be assessed using the Spearman-Brown formula. Next, there are parallel forms or parallel tests, which uses slightly different forms and different tests that are very similar to assess if a certain construct is being measured consistently across different testing methods. That is, if I randomize the questions on a questionnaire, your response should be similar, if not generally identical, regardless of the organization of those questions, correct? Be aware, it's much more complex than that. Without getting too in-depth, the organization and placement of questions in an instrument can have a very large effect on response, given, for example, the energy level of the participant after a long battery of questions, the time of day, all kinds of things. The placement of questions after another potentially affecting the participant's opinion on the next battery of questions. It's a very complicated thing when you talk about coming up with how to test things in social science. But parallel forms is a basic way of measuring this, of saying if I just randomize or reorganize the questions and they still tend to forward the same results, Well, it means that you've got a fairly reliable test. That's the purpose of parallel forms testing, and it is assessed using a Pearson's correlation. Now we have test-retest reliability, which fairly simply seeks to measure if an instrument is consistent over time. For example, a test such as the intelligence quotient, which is high in all forms of reliability I should mention, is a temporally consistent instrument in that we find an adult who takes the IQ test today, both Weiss and Wechsler, will receive a very similar score if he or she retakes it 10 years from now. There are potential confounds here, and for example, that we have a potential for rehearsal effect. That means that if someone takes a test over and over again, they come to be better at it. Thus, if you take an IQ test today, tomorrow, the next day, and the next day for a long period of time, eventually you probably will raise your IQ score. However, this, again, is a rehearsal effect, a practice effect, and has nothing to do with the construct being measured. That's why it's a confound. What that means is that if you stopped taking the test every day, and then you waited 10 years and took it, it would probably be fairly similar to your first result, rather than the last one when you stopped your rehearsing. This is because, due to this practice, you're now no longer actually assessing the G factor in the case of IQ. You're assessing your ability to practice something. But, again, this is a reliable test, so if you wait long enough, it will return to the norm. Through other methods used in tandem, such as parallel forms and spacing between testing, we can see consistency over time without potential for things like rehearsal effects. This test-retest is likely the most important effect for many of you to be aware of in reliability, besides Cronbach's alpha, given this type of reliability is probably the most obvious potentially over time. We know a test is reliable if we can use it again and again and again for decades and find very little variance in the outcomes. Finally, though, we have intercoder reliability, which is only concerned with how we understand our own instruments once again. Intercoder reliability is used most often in qualitative science, as it addresses agreement between coders, usually teaching assistants, in the shared meaning of responses to a test, usually an open-form question, from participants. Although again, most of you are unlikely to encounter this kind of testing and reliability, and thus need pay little attention to intercoder reliability measures, this type of measure is assessed through an analysis called Cohen's kappa. Just something to keep in mind. Well, now let's get into some of the more complicated shit. The validity. We understand now what reliability is, right? It means that my test is consistent over time. I'm trying to test this thing and I find it again and again and again. Under all of the measures I have just described, that makes something reliable. I'm not gonna lie to you, fam. This bit on validity, this might be a little bit of note-taking time if you have not been already. Sorry guys, I know this has been kind of an info dump. Validity is complicated. If you thought reliability seemed complex, remember, we require reliability before we can even start to think about validity, right? Validity is affected by a ton of factors, so many factors it's fucking complicated and almost impossible for me to even begin to start to describe. Everything affects validity. From social desirability or acquiescence bias, that is going along with whatever you think the researcher just wants to hear from your answers, to any number of other confounds in survey methodology, or even experimental error. Validity is complicated. That is why we need to establish reliability first, to know that our findings are consistent. Also that we actually cannot be valid without being reliable, right? Therefore, before we start even beginning to address any of the consistent findings, so let's start by stating the three basic types of validity. These are broad, general categories of validity, by the way. They are subjective, criterion, and construct, all of which will help explicate how we come to operationalize our variables in the testing of a hypothesis, and how we come to see if our tests are actually valid. Of subjective validity, which essentially assesses the mere appearance of validity by the naked eye, there are two types of subjective validity: face and content. Face validity is simple. It asks, does the measure look like it measures what it's intended to measure? Simple, right? For example, if I'm trying to measure human body temperature in response to stimuli, and I show up with a dipstick, does that dipstick look like it's going to measure human body temperature? Does it have any ability to? Probably not. Thus, that lacks mere face validity. Content validity asks if the measure includes all aspects of the measured variables, essentially including a set of boundary conditions. That is, if I have a test that is designed to measure specialized muscle strength, and it only includes more athletic types of training, while ignoring things like, for example, musical muscle training, the incredible amount of muscle training that happens within the hands and the fingers and the arms, that kind of test would lack some sort of content validity, if I'm just looking at general muscle strength or muscle training. Next, we have criterion validity, which describes a construct in relationship to other constructs to establish its existence as valid. Of criterion validity, we have concurrent validity, which describes how a test is specifically associated with previously established measures and constructs. Basically, we already know a whole lot about certain fields in social science and certain constructs. So if I have a new construct I'm trying to assess, I could look at it and see how does it relate to other constructs that we've already analyzed. Does it have anything to do with them? What is this relationship with those? Next we have predictive validity. Perhaps the most important for viewers, in that this describes to what degree an instrument predicts the future through the associative property, with its relation to other variables. For example, we find that having a high GPA in high school is a predictive of a higher college completion rate. It's not the only factor, but it is a predictive variable. We would find that these two things are associated and tend to be associated in a linear manner. Although there may be many other variables involved, such as socioeconomic status, in this mere correlation, when we start to account for said variables, we can start to form a more thorough comprehension of the total predictive validity of a measure such as GPA or any other construct and its given validity. Finally, we have the third form of validity, which is construct validity. This seeks to understand if the instrument is honestly measuring fucking anything of any meaning at all. Of this form, first we have convergent validity, which determines to what degree other variables are positively or negatively associated with the test being administered. For example, that life satisfaction is negatively associated with depression, as we might expect. Next is discriminant validity, which specifically determines a test or construct from other variables to ensure that they are not identical. After all, it makes no sense to create a new test or construct to measure something which has already been assessed. Moreover, discriminant validity allows us to understand what constructs are completely unrelated to one another. They are unrelated to the construct being measured or assessed. This is unrelated things. And this is a little bit important to note because discriminant validity is sort of the opposite of concurrent validity. Lastly, there are known group differences, which are based on extant data of how certain constructs may differ across known groups, data that we already have. Of course, I'm sure for some, the very notion of this well-established aspect of all scientific research would be considered racist or sexist. But that's why you should be watching my videos to understand basic statistical averages between groups. Oops, lest I forget, science is inherently bigoted except when I fucking love it. Oh wait, and only fucking love it when it's a cool looking picture of space or a microbe or something. Put a bullet in my head and send me to Valhalla already. Odin, I'm fucking waiting. Take me. Ugh. The fact is, we know there are differences between groups. For example, we know women are on average shorter than men. As such, if I was assessing something related to height, I would need to make a note of known group differences between men and women, because that affects my variable in some way. But again, apparently, saying something like that, even something that simple, makes me an alt-right Nazi, so Sieg Heil or whatever. Before I end, I want to state a few things about the threats to reliability and validity that affect how we conduct research, and which are also aspects that you, as a reader, and someone potentially interested in reading social science research, should be aware of. Again, social science, as with all sciences, are headed by humans, and thusly is highly subject to fallibility. We're mere mortals. We fuck up all the time. But let's go over how we can fail. First, it's very easy to just select the wrong instrument. For example, you might select a general instrument for something like self-efficacy over a specific measure of self-efficacy. I have seen this personally. For example, when it comes to video games, we have a specific instrument in my field to measure what's called video game-related self-efficacy, where it only has to do with how much you feel you are capable of completing a video game. That measure of self-efficacy is different from generalized self-efficacy, which is how well you feel you are at completing tasks in a daily environment. These are different things. Video games and general life, they're different. We need different instruments. Second are the confounds inherent to any experiment involving humans, such as mood, fatigue, time of day. There are all kinds of things that affect people. I mean, animals too. But we need to be aware of these. Third are confounds of the environment, that the environment can change at any time. There can, again, be all kinds of weirdness that could happen. You just need to be aware of it. And there are things that can affect the outcomes of your study. Fourth are confounds of experimentation, in that it's possible for researcher error to occur, and not all cases to be treated completely evenly. Although we have methods of mitigating this effect, it's always a real possibility that we can just have user error, or in this case, researcher error. Fifth is the problem of instrument truncation, which merely means that we often cannot use an entire single measure in a battery of tests, given it would force participants to spend hours upon hours answering questions, at least in the social sciences. And as such, there can be problems of internal consistency with the truncated questionnaire not being as robust as the full questionnaire. 6 is the potential of failure from confederates or assistants in an experiment. That is, actors in on the experiment being conducted. These actors can be flawed, just as the researchers can be flawed. They could fail in their acting in some way or give away what the meaning of the experiment is. They could also just not convince the participants that they're anything but actors. 7th is simply random error or mechanical failures that we just really can't account for. Although potentially we can toss out said data if we do note that there was an error that occurred, and in my experience we can do that fairly easily, but sometimes, mistakes just seep through the cracks. We need to be aware of this. Finally, the 8th confound lies and errors in data processing. That is, once again, there is the potential for human error when we go in and look at the data itself and run it through a statistical program. That's true, folks. We don't do all this shit by hand. We run it through a number crunching machine. And it's possible that we enter our numbers wrong. With that, well, I think that's everything you need to know about the basics of reliability and validity, how to form a hypothesis, and how to operationalize your variables. Sorry if it was a bit heavy, but I think that it's important that we understand these things. Social scientists don't just sit around and suck each other off, making shit up about how we think things work, and, oh gee, I think this is how this is, and oh boy, I think that's how that is. I mean, Dr. Lehman and I certainly do that, but hang on, that's unrelated. Generally speaking, we have standards of evidence. We require our tests, including a test among many others, such as the Weiss and Wechsler instruments of intelligence quotient, be reliable and valid. I bring those up only because they apparently are in vogue right now. They are reliable and valid under almost every measure covered in this video. The IQ test is a fantastic instrument under the criteria that I have described above. And don't misunderstand me. These are not arbitrary methods that I came up with, nor are the measures invented by us retarded social scientists in our stupid bullshit field. No, my friends. These are the basics of statistics. And statistics, my dude, that's a subsection of STEM. That's right. And if you need a refresher, that's science, technology, engineering, and what's that fourth one? Oh, mathematics, that's right. Yeah, sorry for those out there who think that social science is doo-doo. But unfortunately, generally speaking, we use statistics. And as such, yeah, that kind of falls under STEM. I'm sorry I'm getting a bit off base here, but I'm a bit pissed at how much my field has been openly disrespected of late. I know it's just a personal beef, I suppose, but the purpose of this video really is to disseminate information so that you, my dear friends, have a better ability to read research so that you can read it and discern for yourselves the meaning of the data. You shouldn't really need me to read research for you. You should be able to go out and go to Sci-Hub and find a study and read it and know what it says. And I hope that I'm helping maybe just a little bit. As always, I am primarily working out of Communication Research, Asking Questions, Finding Answers by Joanne Keyton. I'm using the 3rd edition, and the primary onus of this episode was focused around Chapter 3, which is an Introduction to Quantitative Statistics. I also highly recommend the book Discovering Statistics Using IBM SPSS Statistics by Dr. Andy Field. Both of them are excellent resources, of course, although I will be citing them below. They are very easy to find on Libsyn. If you're feeling a little bit yar-har fiddly-dee and not necessarily wanting to pay the $70, for example, the Andy Fields book, which it can sometimes go for. I do, however, recommend that if you want a basic book on understanding statistics, you cannot go wrong with this Joanne Keyton book. It's an excellent resource. As such, I sincerely hope you have enjoyed this video and that it has been of some assistance. I think next we'll probably be covering experiments. I'm not sure, though. I don't have a great plan for this. But if you did enjoy it, please be sure to like and subscribe. I'm Aiden Paladin, Altana Volt.